Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Home Performance Virtual Conference. You are joining today the session on the changing paradigm of energy efficiency and cost effectiveness testing. My name is Julie Michals. I'm with E for the Future, and I'm being joined today by Steve Schiller of Schiller Consulting and my colleague Shayna Fidler, also from E for the Future. And you can find our bios on the HPC agenda conference website. But meanwhile, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to kick us off today. Steve?
Hey, thanks, Julie, and hello, virtual audience. As Julie indicated, my name is Steve Schiller, and I've been working on designing and implementing and assessing efficiency and other distributed resources, actually across 2 centuries, I guess. Today, I'm going to be talking about the future of energy efficiency and the increasing focus on the role of efficiency in supporting demand flexibility as states increasingly invest in distributed energy resources, or DERs, as well as large-scale variable generation renewables. And Julie, Chen, and I all agreed to have this bright future background today because we think it is a bright future, and we're going to talk about it. Before I begin, though, I want to acknowledge the sources of some of the information in my presentation. These include my LBL colleagues and the great work by the Department of Energy's Building Technology Office. However, I need to be really clear the materials included here, particularly any opinions I might express, are my responsibility, not the Berkeley Labs or DOE's or BPA, or I suppose anyone else's. And then I guess you all can decide whether you concur or not after listening. And then I also want to say that I'm going to be making some predictions in this presentation, and I want to very much acknowledge, and I suppose disclaim that yes, predictions, to say the least, do not always come true. Specifically, the topics I'm going to be covering are drivers of the efficiency and energy markets, what will determine, shape our industry's future attributes of our efficiency markets, this growing focus on demand flexibility and what that means. And then I'm going to throw in a little bit on creating value, showing the value, the benefits of efficiency and other distributed energy resources, sort of as a prep for the other 2 presentations. So let me start with drivers of efficiency markets. And I'm going to talk a lot about markets today. And so let me define what I mean by markets. These are the mechanisms or the venues that are the means for buyers and sellers to exchange efficiency goods, services, and really information, primarily for their energy efficiency attributes. 5 market attributes, at least I think about, are the market actors, those buyers and sellers, the products, the delivery mechanisms, the level of integration with other types of services, particularly DERs, and then of course the scale of that market. So that's what I mean when I talk about efficiency markets. So starting off here with what I consider to be the big drivers. Let's start with the overall energy supply and demand markets. And these, again, these opinions are formed by just my experience, really over decades, I'm afraid, of our really ever-changing energy industry in my discussion with others. For example, this slide borrows from a recent National Academy of Sciences report on the future of electricity in the US. So starting off here, I think I can comfortably say that decarbonizing and minimizing the emissions of conventional pollutants is a, of course, driver. Even in parts of the country that historically, shall we say, poo-pawed climate change, utility planners and others I've talked with have admitted it's just a question of when, not if. And this leads to increasing amounts of variable renewable generation of electricity, which is this other driver, which comes with higher wholesale capacity costs, but really lower operating costs, and then certain grid stability challenges. All drivers, which we'll see for energy markets and efficiency. And then regarding natural gas consumption, at least for end uses in buildings, at least I'd expect stable to decreasing amounts of natural gas use. Importantly for efficiency, these first 3 drivers I list impact the next driver, and that's electricity and natural gas prices, and then the retail rate structures. With current predictions from organizations like the Energy Information Agency, that average electricity prices will probably remain stable, maybe even decline in real terms over the next 10, 20 years, while at the same time natural gas prices will likely increase, but probably only modestly. Now, a wild card in this is the consumption for electrification of transportation, which is currently projected by most to be relatively modest over the next 10, 20 years. But of course, this can change as well with more investment in charging infrastructure, as we just saw this week proposed by President Biden. Other factors or drivers of the overall energy and supply demand, as I mentioned on the slide, are increasing reliance on the grid edge resources, distributed generation, storage, microgrids, energy management, of course, efficiency, which I'll obviously be talking about more. And then, unfortunately, another factor is probably more extreme weather events driving increasing interest in resilience of buildings. And then two social issues, concerns about the impacts of decarbonization, energy transition on employment, and the important desire to reduce social inequities as they really relate to energy cost burdens. Now, in this slide, I list some drivers more specific to energy efficiency. Most of these drivers overlap with the drivers of energy and supply demand, as I indicated in the last slide, but I'm calling them out here as one specific importance for efficiency. So let's start with technology changes. Incremental and disruptive technology change and the competition between technologies are a driver. These are ones that are intrinsic, really part of efficiency, such as improving the efficiency of products, and extrinsic to efficiency, such as better data access and management and controls. Next up I list is controls, what it costs to do efficiency, and what is the cost or value of what it displaces. Mostly for value, what we're talking about is energy being displaced, but also the value of non-energy benefits, such as resilience, as I mentioned in the last slide. Of course, consumer economic and demographic conditions drive efficiency, whether the status of the overall economy or the changing demographics of building occupancy, density, energy use patterns. For example, will we see long-term changes due to the pandemic? And then there are the baseline business practices in the efficiency industry. That new great way of delivering efficiency, if it does exist. And lastly, and not least, and these are really connected, social priorities. Changes in societal demographics, practices, and the cultures, and how they affect policy and regulation at the federal, state, and local level. Digging in a little deeper, and I'm not going to read all these, but let me just mention a couple here. Put out in bold, the availability and training of the efficiency workforce. This is going to be an important driver. Will we have those needed workers? I mentioned business models before, such as efficiency as a service, performance contracting, combining efficiency with other DERs. The form of, I mentioned the gas rate schedules, the form of those tariffs. Are they going to be, what are they going to look like? What's that mix of fixed and variable rates that consumers pay? As we all know, working in this industry, how much is fixed, it can be a real impact on the cost effectiveness from a consumer point of view. And then, really importantly, is getting a greater focus on addressing energy burden in long-term equity issues, how that affects our work, whether through it's the electrification or other ways of addressing those issues. Now, I get to turn to crystal ball time. My predictions about the drivers of our efficiency markets, and looking at what might be in the next 10, 20 years, certainly with a recollection that predictions are sometimes a fool's task. First one I list here, energy efficiency in buildings does not have a singular future. We really have a diverse market. It's going to, the future is going to vary across the different market sectors and probably will continue to vary by state. However, I expect anyways, the overall trend will be states increasing their efficiency goals and achievements as compared to today's market. Now, whether that's through codes and standards or efficiency mandates or voluntary programs with or without incentives, we'll see, and again, will probably vary. Now, with respect to those drivers I talked about before, the most important drivers, determinants of market attributes, will fit probably within two major categories in order of importance. One is government energy and climate policies and their regulations, which in turn are, of course, driven by social priorities. And then secondly, the cost of alternative energy resources defined by the cost of energy that efficiency displaces. And while all these drivers are interrelated, government regulations will have a particularly dominant effect on the speed at which cost-effective efficiency is acquired. Thus, these other drivers for the future efficiency are important, but I predict really to a lesser degree. These include consumer economic conditions, those efficiency business practices, and technology changes. And overall, though, because of these major drivers, I would expect efficiency actions to become more and more focused on demand reductions during specific times and in specific locations. To me, the future efficiency involves a very strong emphasis on building controls and demand flexibility, which I'll be talking about more. And I got some other predictions, again, remembering Yoga Bear's saying there from my first or second slide. And again, I'm not going to go through all these, but we're just saying that codes and standards, particularly, are going to be really important, and can affect what many of us work on in terms of incentive programs. If that fundamental baseline becomes more efficient, how that will affect us. Regarding technology advances, whether natural gas or electricity, will continue to be important, but probably not as important and not as breakthrough as we've seen with historic trends. This is due to the long life of many building components, insulation, boilers, chillers, and frankly, the relatively high efficiency, or we already have, of commercially available gas and electricity, products and services. However, I do think that efficiency is going to really benefit from technological advances and cost reductions around areas which I call extrinsic to efficiency, such as sensor and control technology and interoperability, data accessibility, data science, even universal internet access. I think is going to help us a lot and really lead to higher penetrations of efficient technologies in our work. A few more predictions here. Again, I think with time, I won't necessarily go through these, but I do want to remind you of the real possibility of changes to retail rate designs. As the utility system experiences higher capital costs, really the CapEx, but lower operating costs, this will be putting pressure on classic efficiency, which saves kilowatt hours and not peak kW, for example. So I've talked a lot about demand flexibility in these prior slides, so let me dig into that topic a little bit more. Our electricity system's changing. I think we all know that. It's requiring changes in grid operations and greater consideration of loads as a flexible resource. There's an increasing amount of renewable energy, really even in parts of the country one might not expect, such as the Southeast, which this graph below tries to show it. And as I mentioned, there is at least some growth in electric vehicles, but still buildings, residential and commercial, industrial account for something like 75% electricity consumption. In some regions, up to 80% of peak demand, per this multicolor graph from EIA. And with all those adjustable loads, buildings also represent that largest source of demand flexibility. So what is demand flexibility? We know what efficiency is, but demand flexibility is the capability of distributed energy resources to adjust a building's load profile across different time scales. Energy flexibility and load flexibility are often used interchangeably as terms with demand flexibility. And then what that consists of is what I think you all know about. It's load shedding, load shifting, modulating loads, and of course also generating, distributed generation. And these all work together and probably will in some buildings, as I'm showing here in this next slide, which is a graphic showing how manage loads within buildings, managing through efficiency, through shedding, through shifting. In this example, generating, as shown in the third slide, they all can work together to provide important grid services and probably some income for building owners. And what are the buildings that do this? Well, a term that's been coined is grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs. And these are those energy efficient buildings that use smart technologies and those on-site distributed energy resources, DERs, to provide that demand flexibility while optimizing for energy cost and grid services, occupant needs and preferences in really a continuous and integrated way. It's quite an interesting future if we have these buildings operating, and they may be providing these services on a very regular basis. So this next slide is what I'm talking about for the future of GABs. So let's take a quick look here. So it's Tuesday, pow, Super GAB here, Super Grid Integrated Building is ready to protect our grid and make some money. Super GAB is this commercial building participating in an aggregator's day-ahead capacity market program. When its building automation system receives a request to modify the building operations on this Tuesday for the next day in a manner that provides a specific electricity load profile for the hours noon to 7. And then zap, on Wednesday, Super GAB swings into action. It's using machine learning and the results of previous events. The automation system controls the building's multiple DERs to match the requested electricity load profile. Real-time metering and data helps control a generator, charge and discharge, a battery storage system, charge and discharge vehicles in the parking garage, and of course, control the lighting and HVAC systems while keeping the building comfortable. All the while, the energy management systems communicating performance data to the building aggregator and the building operator. In the compow, it's early Thursday. Super GAB is ready to report success, turns in their reports, diagnostic reports, and provides recommendations for future improvement performance. And then this repeats. Super GAB is ready as the pattern is repeated again and again. This is a new future and an important future for us. And again, let me remind you, this demand flexibility is based on building controls, with a bit of a visual reminder for those that remember the movie The Graduate. Now, as my time starts to run out here, let's turn to a quick review of what this can all mean for valuing, putting a value on your efficiency actions or your demand flexibility products and services. First, let me lay the groundwork by saying that properly valuing DERs is required to determine their cost of benefits. And this in turn determines an appropriate amount of investment in DERs by the utilities, by grid operators, consumers, and really society as a whole. The National Standard Practice Manual, the NSPM, is a source of information for valuing distributed energy resources that result in efficiency and demand flexibility being properly valued, and other presenters, our two other presenters in this session, will talk more about the NSPM. Now, it's shown in this slide, which is a little complicated, but let me just say that the orange boxes here, at least orange in my screen, these show the utility system benefits, the customer benefits and the societal benefits to consider, 3 categories. And each of these have subcomponents as shown in the yellow and green boxes, such as distribution and generation cost changes due to demand flexibility, but also supporting reduced pollution for society and say increased reliability for consumers. These are the components that go into valuing demand flexibility. Again, I'm not going to read this, but a key point of that NSPM that Julia is going to be talking about next is that one needs to account for all relevant benefits in assessing demand, the value of this resource, this demand side efficiency, demand flexibility resource. And this matters not only for a regulator trying to decide an appropriate efficiency incentive budget, but also for an efficiency marketer, for your companies looking to show the value of efficiency and how demand flexibility represents a good investment to her customers. So with that last note on valuation, really there's no single economic value of demand flexibility for the utility system or consumers or even society. The value of a single unit, say a kilowatt or a kilowatt hour of grid services provided by demand flexibility, is a function of many things. It's a function of timing, location, the grid services that are actually provided, the service life or the persistence of those impacts, and that avoided cost of what else one could do, such as just buy electricity. And again, as described in the NSPM, demand flexibility evaluation methods and practices to really account for these variations. So with that, let me do a bit of a conclusion, a bit of summary here. And let's, let me start off by mentioning that, look, changes are coming, to our industry. They're already here. I think it's going to be a different industry than it was a few years ago, and certainly one than 10, 20 years ago. And that's a good thing, because efficiency really continues to be part of the American ethos. And it's critical, just critical for reducing the need for more expensive power plants and fossil fuel consumption. Improving the resilience and reliability of our energy infrastructure is just critical, whether it's to address the energy burdens that many of our fellow Americans face, but also for the climate. And so the nature, the role, the value of efficiency is changing, and it's bringing new challenges, but really new opportunities. Thus, for me, concluding with recommendations suggesting for you this efficiency market and industry, consider aligning your business with a future that values non-energy benefits for consumers, such as comfort and resilience, those grid services such as demand flexibility, and the societal priorities such as decarbonization. That you be prepared for new business models and new competitive offers, new competitors really offering comprehensive building services, performance-based offers, and really data and controls-driven solutions. And that you really encourage consistent valuation methods and benefit cost analysis for all DERs. I think that's all going to lead to a bright future. And with that, I'll say thank you and turn it back to Julie.
Thank you, Steve, for that great lead-in to my presentation. And I'm going to share my slides now to share with you more information around the National Standard Practice Manual that Steve alluded to. And sorry, let me just get my controls organized here. There we go. Okay, so a little bit about the NSPM. It is a publication of the National Energy Screening Project, which is a stakeholder organization involving a host of practitioners and other key stakeholders interested in improving cost-effectiveness screening practices for efficiency and other distributed energy resources. Its first publication was the 2017 NSPM for EE, followed by the more recent publication expanded to other distributed energy resources. This NESP also manages and developed this database of screening practices, which you'll hear a bit about today from Shayna Fidler. And E4 the Future is the manager and coordinator of this work, which is largely funded by E4 the Future and in part by DOE. So we have this these two publications. The newer 2020 publication essentially subsumes the NSPM for and expands upon it. And importantly, what you'll see here at the bottom is that the terminology from the NSPM for EE has evolved in the newer version. And so some of you may have participated, attended an earlier BPA or HPC conference in the past few years around the NSPM for EE, and just make note of some of the new terminology around the framework, evolving from the resource value framework to what we're now calling the NSPM BCA framework. We're no longer referring to a resource value test, we're referring to a jurisdiction specific test. The NSPM principles were expanded, and some of the multi-step process was slightly revised. And then of course, we went from a single DER analysis for efficiency to now looking more broadly at multiple DER analyses, as well as covering a whole host of distributed energy resources. So the audience for this NSPM for DRs is all entities really involved in overseeing or guiding investment decisions around DRs or supporting them in one capacity or another. And the purpose really is to help inform and value DERs in the context of expanding efficiency and demand response plans and strategies to include a broader set of DERs, to evaluate and plan for non-wire solution or pipe projects, to incorporate DERs into distribution system planning, and then of course to support the valuation of these resources to achieve specific goals and objectives for a jurisdiction. Moreover, the NSPM concepts in as much as we generally talk about them in terms of cost effectiveness, applying to cost effectiveness analysis for programs, these concepts apply to a host of regulatory mechanisms beyond just traditional programs, if you will, but also procurement strategies, pricing mechanisms such as time varying rates, as well as in the context of distribution system planning, IRP, and even grid infrastructure investments. So who's using and talking about the NSPM? This is just a quick snapshot that we here at E for the Future, we update this quarterly to reflect the growing interest, application and use of the NSPM. And essentially what you see here are green states where commissions have adopted or applied the NSPM in one form or another. Yellow states are where there is an active or serious consideration by a commission to apply the NSPM, while purple states are where there is some referencing and interest in the NSPM, and the dotted ones are where we see even further, more recent referencing. So a little bit about this document. I'm sharing with you here the table of contents. Of course, we don't have time to go through all these components. It is a 300+ page guidance document and is quite dense. Rather, I'm going to focus on a few areas that build on some of Steve's overview of where the efficiency industry is going and the valuation of efficiency in the context of how, you know, cost effectiveness has to evolve along with how the industry is evolving. And not only because of emerging value streams for efficiency, but also the integration of efficiency with other distributed energy resources. So I'm going to focus on some key elements from parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 to give you a flavor of how the NSPM for DRs can be used by jurisdictions to inform BCA for efficiency and other DRs. And I encourage you, of course, to go look at the document, including the more in-depth discussions in the appendices. So this is the BCA framework, and essentially this is part 1 of the NSPM. It includes these 3 components, if you will, a set of fundamental BCA principles, a multi-step process for developing a primary cost effectiveness test, and then guidance on when and how to use secondary tests. And essentially what's important is that the NSPM really presents a process that jurisdictions can use to develop their cost effectiveness test for a range of DRs or some combination of them, or to modify an existing test. Now I'm going to walk through each of these components for you to give you a bit more flavor of what you'll find in this document. Okay, so the principles are the core and what I would call the backbone of the NSPM. And bringing these principles, 8 of them in total, can really help provide a jurisdiction with guidance on, as they develop a test, as they apply a test, to what extent are they aligning with these economically sound and policy neutral principles. They help guide a jurisdiction along with its stakeholders to ensure adherence to these principles that can help support ensuring that a jurisdiction conducts their cost effectiveness analysis in a sound manner. So I'm going to really focus on the first 4 principles. I'm going to walk you through a few of these with some examples and more specifics. I'm not going to spend too much time on the 3rd principle on symmetry because that's where I'll be handing it over to Shayna to go into more depth in that area. So why the first principle? Why consistency in benefit cost analysis across DERs? So a consistent framework across DERs can help ensure and reduce the risk of either over or under investing in a resource. If you have a different set of rules or you're valuing streams differently or using different input assumptions, that can create a bias, if you will, in the treatment of one resource relative to another. Further, siloed approaches to valuing different DRs can be complex and overwhelming for commissions, utilities, and stakeholders. So having a consistent framework can help to ensure that everyone's working from a consistent launching point, if you will, in their review of a resource. Even if it's reviewed in a separate docket, at least you're using the same framework for that analysis. And I'll give you an example of that. And lastly, it allows for comparison prioritization of DER investment options to answer questions such as which DER should be implemented and which should be rejected based on key objectives. What will the key policies be met by investing in the DERs? And how can we ensure that customers are not paying too much for meeting policy goals? And why, second principle, why is benefit cost analysis, the alignment with applicable policies, so important? Well, at the end of the day, form should follow function. And if there are statutes, regulatory decisions, or planning documents, and so forth that identify the purpose for supporting or investing in certain resources and the reasons for them, then those should be reflected and aligned with the impacts that are accounted for in the test. Importantly, a recognition that policies evolve and are dynamic, they are not static, and therefore BCAs need to be updated. We see that happening already since the publication of the NSPM, where some states have had to go back and say, well, we have a new Omnibus Clean Energy Act that has passed. We have to go and revisit what are the goals and objectives for investing in these resources and adjust our testing accordingly. Importantly, too, some considerations is where there are inconsistencies in policies that might exist across states, there may be a need to determine some type of broad or narrow interpretation of those policies and the associated relevant impacts to account for in primary tests. So what are some example policy goals? There are typical overarching goals that we often see traditionally in terms of providing safe, reliable, low cost electricity, protecting low income vulnerable customers, and so forth. We also have specific resource goals that I'm not going to read through all of these, but these should look familiar to you. The last category is often sort of the broader societal type goals. But one point I would make is these are evolving. As Steve referred to, the increase in demand, the need for demand flexibility, especially to support larger scale renewables and the ability to shift, shimmy, and shed load. And lastly, more focus on promoting environmental justice and equity issues. So as jurisdictions are looking to address these different policy goals and objectives, their cost effectiveness analysis of resources should follow suit. And what that means is, considering what is the perspective that what a jurisdiction should be looking at in determining its test. And because we want to see alignment with policies, the NSPM essentially sets forth what we refer to as the regulatory perspective. And that is what you see on the right, where versus where on the left, we see the more traditional perspectives used in cost effectiveness testing, the societal total resource cost perspective, and then the utility system perspective. In both cases, the utility system impacts are central and core to any cost effectiveness analysis for DERs, and therefore they are center in both the left and right illustrations. What's different is the regulatory perspective. The other impacts, the non-utility system impacts, are going to depend on that jurisdiction's goals. Therefore, there isn't a defined line around what those impacts might be. I'll share more of an example with you on that in a few minutes. So what question does a primary test answer? It answers the question of which resources have benefits that exceed costs and therefore merit utility acquisition or support on behalf of the customers. Now, this doesn't mean that it should result in utility acquisition. That depends on what type of boundaries or constraints there might be. Most jurisdictions don't have policies that say invest in all cost effectiveness efficiency. A couple may, but not all jurisdictions do. But it basically answers the question of which are resources where we have a BC ratio of greater than 1. That is the purpose of a primary test. The NSPM sets forth this 5-step process to develop that primary cost effectiveness test, or to review an existing test and make modifications to it. And some of these are specifically where the application of the principles apply. So articulating, taking that inventory of policy goals and identifying what are the relevant impacts to be accounted for given those goals. Ensuring the inclusion of the full range of utility system impacts. We see many cases where the full range of those impacts are not accounted for, and Shayna will touch on that as well. Decide which non-utility system impacts should be included, and to make sure that they are appropriately accounted for, even if they are hard to quantify. Then there are a number of other steps here leading up to ensuring that there's a comprehensive transparent documentation on the development of the test and its application. So in identifying what are the full range of impacts to account for, on the left side here, we have the utility system impacts, the full range of them. And on the right, we have the host customer impacts, often referred to as participant impacts. And then the lower right are the societal impacts. And again, the right two tables are where it may be the case that a jurisdiction has goals that align with inclusion and accounting for these impacts, or it's possible they may not. And I also want to point you here to some of the impacts are very consistent with those that Steve presented in his slides. I think it was around slide 21, where we're showing the demand flexibility type values that fall within a mix of the utility system impact from the utility's perspective, but also for the host customer, the reliability, the resilience. I think Steve also had their improved power quality. And then of course there are the societal impacts. So for any one jurisdiction, it's entirely possible that depending on its goals, it may end up with a test that is different from one of the traditional tests. We all are familiar with the utility cost test, the total resource cost test, and the societal cost test. And those are depicted here as jurisdiction JST 1, 2, and 3 respectively. And yet the fourth example, the JST number 4 here, is where a jurisdiction's policy goals lead it to developing a primary test that is unique to that jurisdiction. And that is the flexibility that the NSPM provides, that the traditional guidance that comes largely from the California Standard Practice Manual doesn't allow for that level of flexibility. That isn't to say that a jurisdiction may not apply the NSPM and end up either at a utility cost test or a TRC or a societal cost test, but it may lead it to adopt a test that is different from these traditional tests. And again, you'll hear more about that in a minute. Okay, so BCA for efficiency and other DRs does get more complicated. What are the key factors that can affect whether an impact is a net cost or benefit? The NSPM dedicates a whole area in the part 3 around all the different DERs. It goes through each of them and addresses specifically what are some of these key factors. And what we see here when we're looking at the full range of DERs is, and this is just focusing in on utility system impacts, is typically these impacts are either a benefit, a cost, that's the green and red, or depending on the use case, depending on a number of factors, it may be a net benefit or cost, and those are the orange dots. And what are the examples of the factors? It might be the specific use case. It might be what those capabilities and operational profiles are, and Steve mentioned some of that. It might depend on who owns and operates the DER, the locational temporal impacts, interactive effects across the DERs, and so forth. In the next couple slides, I'm going to give you just a flavor of what these are, and then I'll conclude. So here's an example from the NSPM that shows on the upper left the temporal impacts on, in this example, energy efficiency benefits. These are hypothetical, but essentially showing the different range of impacts, whether you are using annual data, quarterly data, or have more granular hourly data. And that's going to affect the extent of your impact. And on the lower right are the locational impacts, in this case for a hypothetical demand response example. And again, comparing system average to a locational unconstrained area to a constrained area. In this example here, I mentioned interactive effects earlier. This is very key in an area where we are still gathering information in many pilot projects around the country to better understand what are these interactive effects across different DERs. And on the far left, this is a very simplified example of where you have distributed PV combined with storage, efficiency, and demand response without interactive effects. But if you look at the intersection of PV and storage, you might have a positive interactive effect, but you may actually have a lowering of an interactive effect when you combine efficiency and demand response. And that may be because an efficiency measure may not be operating during a demand response event, or operating less. And so therefore, the value of efficiency is going to go down. So these are all considerations that need to be taken into account. And when you're looking at the holistic and full impact of the resources, you have to account for these type of interactive effects. So with that, that is my last slide. We're leaving some information here with you on where you can find more information on the NSPM, but I'm now going to turn it over to Shayna to take it from here.
Thank you, Julie. An important aspect to capturing the entire impact of DERs is to follow Principle 3 of the NSPM that Julie just described, and account for all benefits and all costs of that DER. So today I'm going to do a deep dive on symmetry and address the subsequent concerns when asymmetry is presented in cost-effectiveness testing. So I'm going to take you through the extent to which asymmetry exists in testing practices and what can happen to a benefit-cost ratio when asymmetry is in your test, and then how to modify your current testing practices using the NSPM so that they are symmetrical. So we want to avoid asymmetry in BCA because it can create biases. So, for example, if your costs are excluded, but your benefits are still included in your benefit cost analysis, that's going to create a bias towards your benefits. On the other end of this, if you have costs that are included, but exclude some benefits for a certain impact, BCA results will be biased towards the cost. Now, when BCA results are biased towards benefits, that results in a tendency to overinvest in a program. This is rarely the case in practice, as we'll see shortly, and more often, costs are included, but benefits are excluded, which leads to underinvestment in a program. And this is problematic, especially when policy goals involve DER program development. And it's important to note when you're assessing symmetry to only assess benefits and costs for the same type of impact. For this presentation, I'll mainly be focusing on host customer impacts, but you can also consider benefits and costs and symmetry in, for example, utility system impacts as well. This is just an example of some of the host customer impacts that are described in the NSPM, and some were described by Steve earlier. The red transaction costs are usually described just like that, as a cost in benefit cost analysis. And now these green categories are usually expressed as benefits in benefit cost analyses. As you can see, things like productivity, comfort, health and safety, and satisfaction are all a little bit more subjective and likely will need new research to be able to value these in benefit cost analysis accurately. Now, this is a screen grab from the Database of Screening Practices, which serves as sort of a repository of current state cost effectiveness testing practices. And here you can find out which impacts are included in state benefit cost analyses frameworks. This is an example of about 20 states and how they include participant or host customer impacts in their cost benefit analysis tests. So you can see that many states account for these measured costs, these host customer costs in their benefit cost analyses. But then if you take a look at these benefits, you see a lot of no's here. So it's kind of the trend where states are not including these participant benefits in their cost benefit tests. In fact, only 1 in 5 of these states are completely symmetrical or mostly symmetrical in that they're including some host customer benefits in their cost benefit analyses. Now, these states that say mostly yes are for the most part symmetrical. They do account for some host customer benefits, but we want to see a little bit more host customer benefits accounted in these tests to kind of capture the whole picture. So California is a really good example of where there would be asymmetry in the test. You can see that they count for those measure costs, but they don't count for any of the other benefits: asset value, comfort, health and safety, satisfaction, and productivity. Now, there's a few reasons why people usually don't account for host customer benefits in their benefit cost analysis. They're usually expensive or hard to quantify. Jurisdictions also have a tendency to avoid using proxies to quantify some of these impacts. And this is kind of why Julie said the use of the TRC for testing is almost broken. And the NSPM is really necessary to really capture that regulatory perspective instead of having states kind of pick and choose which impacts to include without really taking symmetry into account. In this example, you can really see how the exclusion of host customer non-energy benefits impacted BCA. You can see that with these impacts not included, you're missing out on $4,000 worth of benefits that will go into your ultimate benefit cost ratio. So in this example, the host customer non-energy benefits actually determine whether or not the program you're assessing is cost effective or not. And the only way to really exclude host customer non-energy benefits and have your test be symmetrical at the same time is to exclude host customer costs, which we see New Hampshire did when they revised their cost benefit analysis framework. So New Hampshire changed their BCA framework to account for these impacts symmetrically. They went through the NSPM application process to produce the Granite State test. Now, they used to use a modified version of the TRC, which had asymmetry in 2 areas. The first area I'll be going over is utility system impacts. Now, before, New Hampshire was only accounting for some of these utility system impacts. And as Julie said, the NSPM really recommends that you include all utility system impacts in your cost benefit analysis, which is what they ultimately ended up doing. Now, the second place where there was asymmetry is with the participant impacts. A lot of participant costs were included, but not any of the benefits. And going into applying the NSPM and creating the Granite State test, there was really no consensus on the investment or of the evaluation to study full range of participant benefits. So they just decided not to include participant impacts at all. And that's symmetrical because you're not including the costs either. There are a lot of methods that are currently being used to quantify these impacts, whether it be utility system or host customer, and they can be split into 2 main categories, the first of which being monetary, in monetary terms. Jurisdictions will often borrow monetary numbers from other jurisdictions using avoided cost or impact studies and kind of apply it to their own jurisdiction using statistical analysis. And this will give you that monetary number for valuing your impact, and it will be included in your BCA. Now, the other method for inclusion is by use of proxies. And rather than using monetary terms, proxies can illustrate the value of that non-energy impact as it relates to another monetary impact. So this is not monetized by conventional means and is used rather in relation to another impact. And you can use a percentage adder or multiplier to come up with this number. Now, the other category is non-monetary terms, and alternative thresholds are a good way to kind of avoid bias. You're accounting for benefits and costs that have not yet been monetized and that you don't plan on monetizing in your BCA. These are very popular with low income programs because projects can often be deemed cost effective, even if they don't reach that threshold of having a benefit cost ratio of 1.0. And the last method for quantification is not included in BCA and rather included alongside and is qualitatively analyzed. And this is where the impact is kind of evaluated in terms of their relevance to the program being evaluated and their relevance to the overall program as a whole. And a lot of the times quantification of these impacts is not yet they haven't reached their full potential yet. So we need to see research in the future, especially after the change in administration and after some current events. Hopefully we'll be able to see research on occupant health impacts and benefits to the building occupant in wake of COVID-19. We can see some research being done in increasing customer resilience and reliability. So that's kind of the ability for utilities to keep the lights on during either extreme weather events or in times of high demand. This is kind of what Steve was talking about in the increase in demand response and demand flexibility programs. And lastly, we see some research being done in customer equity. So do all of these customers reap the same amount of benefits from participating in a program? And are the benefits distributed evenly? It's going to be really important to see how these benefits impact people in single family homes or multifamily homes, or even customers in low income neighborhoods. We can take away a lot of things from this deep dive in asymmetry. First, we can take away that over or under investment in programs can kind of derail the process for states to meet their policy goals regarding DERs. And we can see that if it benefits the host customer and if the state has a policy goal to include host customer impacts, then that should also be included in your BCA. Especially if the host customer is partially funding or investing a bit of themselves into this DER program. This comes into effect with bring your own device programs, where the customer has to pay for the measure in order to participate in the program, or again with ratepayer funded programs. We know that there's no right quantification method for these impacts yet. Each of them have their trade-off, and many of them have not been researched to their full potential yet. So there's really a lot of different ways to quantify these resources, and they're not consistent across all DERs and all states quite yet. And lastly, due to the current changes in administration, increasing focus on DER programs and current events, it'll be interesting to see how states in the future increase their effort to assess the value of host customer impacts in programs. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can email me, and I encourage you to check out the database of screening practices.
Thank you, Shayna, for that overview, and hopefully that gave everybody a flavor of the challenges with asymmetrical treatment of costs and benefits, especially as they relate to efficiency. And I think increasingly with even other DERs, this is going to be a very prevalent issue in terms of how to quantify a host customer type of benefits associated with things like distributed storage and distributed PV and other electric vehicles and so forth. Yet, exciting to see that we are observing more jurisdictions embarking on trying to quantify some of these values. With this concludes our respective presentations, and thank you both. And since we don't have a live audience, we thought we'd leave with one question that I'm going to actually ask Steve to tackle, which is, given our discussion here today and including your presentation, what would you say are the biggest challenges to valuing efficiency going forward, given the changing paradigm? And what do you think are some of the potential solutions to those challenges?
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Julie. It's a good question. Thinking about it as you're saying that, there's probably two areas. One is kind of a technical issue, which is just data access. Having the information available that indicates, what are the impacts and benefits of those. And we're doing way better at getting information. The data revolution, the concept of database policy and regulation is really come to the forefront, but still difficult often to get the information about the performance. And part of that is appropriate issues around privacy and more so cybersecurity. But we really still have some technical issues about interoperability, getting the communication from the building, to the grid operator, to the aggregator, to the evaluator, that type of information. We have, advanced metering infrastructure in many parts of the country, but many parts we don't. And there's an ongoing question within the industry as to whether, that AMI, advanced metering infrastructure, is necessary, or with the advance of building controls and information transfer, all kinds of networks being available to share information, can we use that if we don't have AMI? So my first sort of technical response is a barrier is getting the data, and we're working on that. The other area is kind of a little more difficult to describe, and that's someone has to actually care in order to request the information. It starts with, the policymakers, regulators, utilities, grid operators, really even the consumers, caring that we have this demand flexibility, efficiency resource, and that they value it to the extent that they want to make sure they value it properly. So the second part of what I see as barriers is just making sure that the people in the position to, require the value assessments do actually require the value assessments, and to make sure they take this seriously enough to do a proper job to what I think all of us here consider to be an extremely valuable resource, whether it's for its grid services potential or for its value in terms of supporting consumer and societal benefits, including just simply reducing the energy burden of those who are so impacted by the cost as part of their simply just living, having energy. And we do have movement certainly on the technical side. I mentioned in my presentation reference to Department of Energy's Building Technology Office. This is a topic that they're working on. They're very focused on GEBs and how to properly assess those, improve their performance, and make sure that they're realized that we live up to the potential that we know is there. And I think that's really a theme of all of our work, is that working towards fulfill the potential of efficiency, demand flexibility, and demand side resources that we all know is there. We just need to properly value it and make it real. So that's my long answer to your short question.
No, that's a great answer. And I think it makes me think too that one thing that I know jurisdictions, and this has come up with even with the application of the NSPM, is with some of these new value streams that we're needing to quantify, there's also the initial first step of, well, what data points, what are the metrics, what are the data points we need to start gathering so that we can then better value this? And I think that is that applies to not just demand flexibility, but some of the policies and emerging policies, especially around equity, ensuring equity across all the different customer sectors and so forth. So I think there's lots of work to be done, and this isn't going to be easy necessarily, but it seems that there is, I'm not sure we'd say a tipping point, but we are coming to a tipping point of certainly increased interest in tackling some of these issues, and hopeful that, to your point, Steve, that indeed there will be follow through on ensuring that efforts are made to, and resources are there to help with some of these, quantification efforts. So with that, I'd like to thank you both. And, I can't tell if we're riding into the sunset here, if it's a sunrise.
Sunrise.
Background, it's a sunrise. Okay, so the sun is rising. It's a beautiful spring day. Thanks again to you both, and look forward to working together this year.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie and Shayna. Take care.